The president's right that NATO allies don't do enough for their own defense, but he forgets the second part of that equation, which is that no dominant power has ever had as much voluntary assistance in the maintenance of the international order that keeps it safe and prosperous as the United States has had.
Europe is frightened and frightening for the first time really since the 1980s. That is Dr. Kori Shake's compelling first sentence in her essay in the Great Decisions briefing book, which we sell and I highly recommend. Frightened and frightening, and honestly, I can't do better than that, so I won't try. Things have changed even since the January publication of this essay, coinciding with the beginning of the game-changing Trump administration, and they're continuing to change very rapidly. To quote from the briefing book again, or to refer to it, there's obviously different scenarios that one can talk about how NATO might evolve or change, but it seems to me they all come down to two sides of one essential coin. Can the U.S. remain prosperous and secure if Europe is not? And can Europe be secure without U.S. involvement? So welcome to tonight's Great Decisions program on the future of NATO and European security. I'm Mary Eintema, President and CEO of WorldBoston, and it's wonderful to see you tonight in the room at the Boston Public Library. It's my great pleasure to introduce our speaker. Kori Schake leads the Foreign and Defense Policy team at the American Enterprise Institute. She's the author of 5 books, including Safe Passage, The Transition from British to American Hegemony, and a contributing writer at The Atlantic, Foreign Affairs, CNN, Politico, The New York Times, The Wall Street Journal, The Washington Post, War on the Rocks, and Bloomberg. I think we're in very good hands. Please welcome Kori Schake.
So the great scholar of NATO history, Stan Sloan, famously wrote that the 3 oldest refrains in the liberal West are NATO's in crisis, deterrence is breaking down, and we need new thinking. And I love that he wrote that in about 1982, because it was before the end of the Cold War, which occasioned a great anxiety about whether NATO still had a purpose with the collapse of the Soviet Union and the Warsaw Pact. And the out-of-area debate, that is, could an alliance defined in defensive terms, that is, the commitment the 32 countries who are NATO members make to each other, is that an attack on any one of them will be considered an attack on all of them. And the NATO alliance then and now is unique among American commitments in that it has a standing and an integrated military command, where the United States officers and officers from 31 other countries work together in headquarters spread across North America and Europe to enable them to fight in a connected kind of way. So what I love about Stan's comment is that we have a tendency to see the current moment as uniquely anxious, and it actually is, right? President Trump is unique among American presidents since 1945 in that he's the first one who genuinely seems not to believe in the liberal international order. That is, he does not seem to believe that the United States as a stabilizing force for like-minded countries and friends around the world is contributing to the security and the prosperity of the United States. And not only is that an underlying philosophical approach that the leader of the free world has, as his commentary today about the potential for U.S. attacks on Iran, I think, makes clear, President Trump has a tendency and a desire to be the center of attention. So Alice Roosevelt Longworth, Theodore Roosevelt's daughter, famously said of her father that he wanted to be the baby at every christening, the bride at every wedding, and the corpse at every funeral. And I love that description, not just of Theodore Roosevelt, but I think it's true of President Trump also, right? He makes outrageous statements because he's so desperate for the attention that he gets, that it's very easy to overcorrect to the outrageous statements and not hold him accountable for the policies that do or don't match those statements and the follow through by his administration. But President Trump has said some pretty alarming things about the NATO alliance. A few years ago, he said he didn't care what Russia did to any NATO member that wasn't paying 2% of its GDP. He talks as though NATO's a protection racket, right? Like, we'll defend you if you pay what we think is appropriate, instead of a solemn obligation among mostly free societies to each other's protection. And even recently, he is stridently suggesting that the United States might withdraw all of its troops from Europe if Europeans don't spend more of their treasure on defending themselves. He's not wrong about the fact that it's frustrating that European allies who have been greatly at risk, especially since 2022 when Russia invaded Ukraine, that didn't create an enormous tidal wave of greater commitment to the defense of countries in Europe. If Dwight Eisenhower, who was the most European president the United States has had, and who was NATO's first Supreme Allied Commander for Europe, when Eisenhower testified in 1951 that the United States should station troops on a long-term basis in Europe, he explicitly said it should only happen until Europe's economies recovered and they could provide for their own defense. So many of NATO's founders would be astonished to see we still have 90,000 American troops in Europe. Moreover, the original intention of the NATO alliance wasn't to be a military alliance, right? The NATO Charter, when it's signed in 1949, doesn't have military applications, doesn't have command structures, it doesn't have exercises, it doesn't have the webbing together of allied militaries. It takes North Korea's invasion of South Korea in 1950 to scare the United States, Canada, and at that time, 10 other NATO allies into building the only integrated military command that the United States participates in anywhere in the world. And when they did so, it was clear that the defense of Europe wouldn't be credible. Remember, Germany is still disarmed in 1950, and you're only 5 years away from World War II. When the United States adamantly insisted that Germany be rearmed in 1954, President Eisenhower, again, the most European president the United States has ever had, President Eisenhower threatened Europe with an agonizing reappraisal. That's his actual language. An agonizing reappraisal of America's commitment to Europe if they wouldn't agree to admit Germany into the European collective and allow its rearmament. And guess what? Europeans didn't anyway. And guess what else? President Eisenhower did not carry out an agonizing reappraisal. He admitted Germany to NATO instead of admitting it into the European-only collectives, because then and now, when Europeans are fearful for their security, they only feel safe if the United States is involved in the settlement. So NATO has had 10 rounds of expansion, and I think the three most consequential: Germany's admission in 1954, because that required an enormous leap of faith by the United States and the countries of Western Europe that the Germany they were looking at 9 years after the end of World War II was a different country than they had seen in 1945. And unquestionably, like now when we think about it, you think about contemporary Germany and you're worried they're not militaristic enough, right? Not that they're too scary. NATO's first Secretary General, Lord Carrington, famously said, when asked, "What is NATO about?" he said 3 things. NATO exists to keep the United States in, the Soviets out, and the Germans down. And it's a good joke and largely true in its time, but it hasn't been NATO's objective to keep Germany down for a very long time. And what we wanted is what we got, which is a modern Germany that is a good neighbor, a force for stability in Europe, and with an army strong enough to scare the Soviets and not strong enough to scare the French. Right? Like, that's what we were going for, and we got it. The second consequential round of NATO expansion, I think, was the first admission of former Warsaw Pact states, right? Poland, Hungary, and the Czech Republic. And I encourage you, when you think about whether there are red lines we should worry about crossing with Russia, to take into account that there are lots of red lines we have crossed with Russia. And there was a lot of anxiety at the time of the admission of Poland, Hungary, and the Czech Republic that it would occasion either a collapse of political progress in Russia or an attack on those countries that NATO allies would have to defend. I think what NATO did in that round of expansion is actually really an interesting fingerprint of the organization, because they took everybody's concerns into account. They created a NATO-Russia Council so that the Russians could have involvement with the alliance and could make their views known. It created a partnership for peace. That is, the idea was to start practical cooperation with those countries to help them get to civilian-controlled militaries and to transparency in their budgets and to the subordination of the military to civilian control in those countries before you made them NATO members. That is, that there are standards they had to meet before the rest of us were willing to run the risks that we would run by committing to their defense. And NATO even agreed it wouldn't station troops in those countries, so it wouldn't move the border of NATO forces closer to Russia. And what I think is so interesting about that as a fingerprint of the alliance, I'm going to come back to this at the end, is that what a consensual alliance, right? Nobody's forced to join NATO. We have the opposite problem. People are clawing to get in. I mean, in 1990, Argentina wanted into the NATO alliance. The North Atlantic Treaty Organization, a country in the Southern Hemisphere and the borders on the Pacific, wanted into NATO because what the alliance is a promise of security for its members that permits lower defense spending than any of us, including the United States, would have to have if we didn't have the help of our allies. And I do want to kind of bang my shoe on the table a little bit on this subject, because The president's right that NATO allies don't do enough for their own defense, but he forgets the second part of that equation, which is that no dominant power has ever had as much voluntary assistance in the maintenance of the international order that keeps it safe and prosperous as the United States has had. And the reason is because we don't force people to join our alliance, we don't blackmail them by demanding things in return for their defense. We argue all of the time about policy with our NATO allies, and yet at the end of the day, NATO operates on consensus. Everybody has to agree. When I worked in General Powell's staff, I was his NATO desk officer. We would go over to the NATO military committee meetings. Anybody know how large the military of Luxembourg is?
900, isn't it? Something like that?
You're close, 1,700. Its senior officer is a lieutenant colonel. Luxembourg gets as many votes over NATO's use of force, employment of force, strategy, and everything else as the United States gets. And that's the reason the US gets so much voluntary assistance, because we actually have to win the argument, even with our allies. You have to take Luxembourg's concerns into account. I mean, right now, we have a NATO summit coming up on June 24th and 25th. To be honest, I would have advised the NATO Secretary General, Mark Rutte, to fake a heart attack and postpone the summit, because I was genuinely worried that President Trump would use that moment to announce either America's withdrawal from the NATO alliance or the pulling all of American troops out of Europe, which at a time when Ukraine is under siege from Russia and European allies are frightened that they cannot defend themselves without our help, would be profoundly destabilizing to the European security order. But I underestimated how great an alliance NATO is, because I wasn't the only person who had that idea to tell Mark Rutte to have a heart attack. NATO allies were worried too. And what they did, instead of throwing us out, instead of canceling the summit, they did something much better, which is they know us with such intimacy that they crafted a better outcome, right? The magical 5% defense spending that's going to be adopted at the NATO summit, NATO allies were smart enough to know President Trump wanted bling. He wanted a big, fancy number. Okay, 3.5% is what NATO internally has concluded all of us need to be doing in order to carry out NATO's defense plans. So they added on 1.5% to get to the magic bling number of 5. And that's going to be for repaving the Autobahn, for strengthening bridges, for infrastructure projects that governments want to do anyway, because that gets them to someplace. They know that President Trump's going to focus on the number. He's not going to read the fine print, and there's not going to be follow through by the Trump administration. So they pulled a rabbit out of their hat. In a way, only countries that have 75 years of experience of dealing with a difficult ally know how to do in order to buy time for events to play out in a more advantageous way. That's what the NATO alliance is brilliant at. And this isn't a new attribute of the NATO allies. Think, so 1954, I already mentioned the agonizing reappraisal. Those allies quickly agreed to the admission of Germany and its rearmament in NATO, provided that the United States had a whole bunch of troops stationed in Germany, and that the four-power occupation of Germany that had been part of the World War II settlement would continue. 1967, when is the Suez crisis? 56, thank you. The Suez Crisis, the United States threatened to bankrupt Great Britain if they did not end their war trying to take possession of the Suez Canal. We played hardball with Britain, France, and Israel in order to support Egypt's sovereignty. Everybody thought that was going to be the end of the alliance. And then what you got was very quickly a British-American nuclear sharing arrangement to paper over that difficulty and give us common work to do together. 1967, after the French withdrew from the NATO Integrated Military Command and the Nuclear Planning Group over a dispute with the first Kennedy and then Johnson administration about nuclear strategy. 1967, you get the famous Harmel report that says, we believe in deterrence and détente. Namely, we believe in confrontation and non-confrontation at the same time. 1984, NATO agrees to the deployment of intermediate range nuclear forces and their elimination at the exact same time. This is the superpower of the NATO alliance, which is finding some formula that all of us can agree to muddle through together. Because at the end of the day, what makes the NATO alliance so enduring is that neither the United States nor its allies have a better option than each other. My entire career of working on transatlantic security stuff, I have been looking for better allies to trade the Europeans in for. As soon as I find those allies, it's over. But in all of these years, I have not found those allies. And Europeans do not newly find the United States a tiresome, erratic, unpredictable, and unreliable ally. That's what they think we have been almost our entire time as an ally. You know, people think there was a magical, mythical age when the United States didn't elect crazy politicians, but we had statesmen who didn't engage in the tawdriness of domestic politics. And Europeans were allies that followed American direction and weren't putting roadblocks in our way all of the time. My friends, I'm a historian of NATO. I cannot find that time. It is always difficult because everybody has domestic politics. Everybody has more than one thing they're trying to do at the same time. Everybody's worried they're going to get abandoned. Their allies aren't going to show up for them. That's the nature of an alliance relationship among free societies. You can't make each other do anything. You have to try and win the argument so that they want to. But that is what makes NATO such an enduring alliance. So a couple of years ago, President Macron, France's president, declared NATO brain dead. And you know, President Macron has a tendency to want to run to the front of any parade he sees forming. It's striking he's not talking that way now, right? And the difference, what happens in the meantime, is Russia's full-on invasion of Ukraine. And so what you saw after 2014 is European defense spending ranking up, NATO defense planning getting a lot more serious than it had been in previous years, concern about Russian hybrid warfare, cable cutting, poisonings in Britain and elsewhere. You see the convergence of the NATO alliance because all of us are worried about the security environment that all of us are facing. And when we are scared, we tend not to want to be scared by ourselves. We want to be scared in the company of our closest friends. And that's what the NATO alliance gives the United States, as well as what it gives our allies in Europe. A couple of things to watch for at the summit. So nobody's talking about the end of NATO. Everybody's trying to figure out what will it take to keep the United States committed, because they are justifiably worried, as I am worried, about erratic choices by President Trump But I'm actually quite upbeat that NATO's going to outlive everybody in this room. And the reason is twofold. First, because as I hope I have shown, the alliance is good at finding compromises that muddle through. That's what free societies are good at. The second thing is that free societies don't really fight each other. And so we feel safest in the company of other free societies. Anybody know the only time two democratic countries went to war against each other? It's such an obscure reference. No, Britain, Britain hasn't yet expanded the franchise enough that I think they qualify. But it's a really good guess. So the answer, it's much more recent than 1812. There are 3 examples of democratic countries going to war with each other. They're the same 2 countries in all 3 cases. It's Britain and Iceland in 1957, 1973, and 1975. And here's what's great about that example. They're fighting over fishing rights. Iceland doesn't even have a military, and Britain lets them win. That's what I love about the example, because that's what free societies do. They don't wring every last ounce of leverage out of an exchange. They try and find mutually beneficial outcomes. And that's what NATO's so brilliant at. And that's why it has weathered so many storms, so many crises, so many times when we worried deterrence was breaking down and we needed new thinking. And those 32 free countries, well, Turkey, Hungary, I'm a little worried, but for the most part, free societies work together to common purpose. They buy time, they muddle through. That is, they do in the alliance family the same thing that we do in the democratic domestic family, which is find a way to rub along together, because the alternative is so much worse than continuing to cooperate with each other. And I think I'll stop there and take questions if you like.
There seems to have been quite a bit of discussion recently about defense industrial production capacity in Europe relative to Russia after Russia is mobilized for war. What prospects do you think there are of working within the NATO governance structure in order to plan out increase in defense production?
It's a great question. And there's definitely a shortfall of defense production in Europe. But guess what? There is also an enormous shortfall of defense production in the United States. And the United States piece of it is even more consequential because so many allies fundamentally rely on American-produced weapons, aircraft, ships. So Europeans the European Union has just committed to a big $600 million fund of defense industrial production. Like, Europeans get it. They're desperately worried, especially after they saw the Trump administration turn off weapons deliveries and turn off intelligence sharing with Ukraine, that a rogue America could do that even to its closest friends and allies. And so there's a lot of momentum around defense industrial production in Europe. The French are trying to drive an arrangement in which the United States couldn't participate in that, and Germany and the other allies are resisting that. So you have the typical European problem, which is, do they want solely European, that is a European pillar with no connections to the US? And most Europeans don't want that because they fear it will facilitate the US doing nothing. And so, that's the argument NATO has on every policy issue for the last 76 years. But I will just give you an example that Australia has given an enormous amount of military aid to Ukraine. And they have been told by the United States that it will take American defense industry 7 years before they can replace what Australia has given. So we need a US defense industrial plan. Europeans need it. Japan, Australia, South Korea need it. In fact, South Korea is a major provider of weapons, tanks, and stuff to Poland because they can't get them fast enough from the United States. And they have money they want to spend because they're a frontline state because of Russia's invasion of Ukraine. So all of us need to do better nationally. We also need to do better cooperatively. We should be licensing allied countries to be able to build factories and produce things that American defense industry wants produced for our own use and for allied use.
Hi. In this particular war, Ukraine has used drones to basically kill tanks to keep the Black Sea fleet either sunk or in its harbors. And the Russians have also, in turn, used the drones to basically kill all the M1 Abrams tanks that we gave them, except for one. What role is anybody thinking about the small little drones, those quadcopter drones that are being used?
Okay.
Everybody's thinking about it. Everybody's thinking about it, right? Because not just drones, but the persistent surveillance of the battlefield and the ability to have precision strikes. If you can see it, you can hit it. If you can hit it, you can kill it. It has collapsed mobility on the battlefield. And so that's why we're back to World War I, where if you are in motion, you are detectable. And so it's stopped mobility on the battlefield in a lot of ways. That is a problem every single military needs to worry about, not just the Russians and Ukrainians. And everybody is, the nerd majors in everybody's military are staying up nights trying to figure out how to restore mobility on the battlefield in this intelligence and precision strike environment. The second way that I think drones have really made a difference, and we see it in Ukraine, is the merging of civil society, the merging of business and government. So, in a way, the United States would panic at having to do. You have teenagers looking out their windows and spotting Russian troop movements and going to a government website and reporting it, that the Ukrainian military then double checks and uses for targeting. That kind of civil military fusion, there are many free societies that are already good at that, Finland, Sweden, right? But the major militaries would, especially those who have never fought a home game, would be very nervous, and figuring out how to utilize the strengths of civil society, including technology and including private businesses, is going to be a major challenge that drones exemplify. And the third way that I think drones have, the drone wars over Ukraine have really impacted how we think about warfare, is the exquisite espionage operations that we saw Israel carry out and that we saw Ukraine carry out deep in the Russian heartland, right? The use of artificial intelligence, of remote sensing, of utilizing localized communication networks for espionage purposes. Man, that worries me about anybody flying a drone in Omaha, Nebraska, right, where the U.S. Strategic Command headquarters are. We all have to figure out, how do we protect our airspace from something that is in routine civilian use but could be used for espionage or outright military attacks?
So I've got a good question here on Zoom. So some people say that the expansion of NATO in the 1990s ultimately led to the invasions of Ukraine in 2014 and 2022. What do you think about that, and where does that likely take us for the future of Ukraine vis-a-vis NATO?
So I think that's a really good question and a really important challenge that all of us have to think our way through. When I was working on NATO military issues in the Pentagon in the 1990s, I actually opposed the admission of Poland, Hungary, and the Czech Republic into NATO for exactly that reason, that I believed in the early and mid 1990s that the road to security in Europe would go through Moscow and could go through Moscow. But there are two problems with that that led me to change my view. The first problem is that I think there were enough worrying signs by the mid-1990s about Russia's own trajectory that it was willing to be a normal European country. I mean, in the NATO-Russia Council, the Russians didn't want that. They wanted to sit in a room with the United States and determine the fate of Europe. They didn't want Europeans to have a vote in that. They wanted us to help them restore a great power, restore Russia as a superpower. And I think that's something the United States was justifiably unwilling to do, because in order to do it, you would have to negate the sovereignty of countries that were struggling to come out of the yoke of Russian power and struggling to become democratic, free, and prosperous societies. You would have had to consign them to a Russian sphere of influence in order for the stability of Europe to go through Moscow instead of through Warsaw and other Eastern European countries. So I think it's a really important question, but I actually don't think it's true that NATO expansion caused the domestic changes we're seeing in Russia. And I would suggest that we have a fair amount of data since then. Most recently, when Sweden and Finland joined NATO, Russia threatened fire and brimstone if they did. And once they did, Russia removed Russian forces from along the Finnish border because they didn't have anything to fear from Finland anymore, and they needed those troops in the war in Ukraine. So Russia, by its own choices about its own security, has shown that countries joining NATO actually make them less of a threat to Russia, not more of a threat to Russia.
And so then, looking forward to the future of Ukraine vis-a-vis NATO. It's a tough one.
I very strongly favor NATO admitting Ukraine once the war is over. And I very strongly favor us giving Ukraine all of the support they need in order to restore their internationally recognized sovereign territory. Because Russia's going to be a threat to Europe until Russia realizes it cannot achieve by force what it wishes it could have. The only way they are going to become a prosperous society themselves is if they stop being a threat to their neighbors. And by the way, the Ukrainian army, the war those men and women are fighting, would make them a fabulous ally to our country and to the other NATO countries. All of us should be going to school on what the Ukrainian military is able to do.
My question is about Finland, which you mentioned. I think Finland joining NATO in response to the invasion of Ukraine was quite shocking, considered their long history during the Cold War of meticulously neutral foreign policy. Do you think it was just the invasion of Ukraine that tipped them over, or was this inevitable?
So I do think you saw a dramatic change in public attitudes in many free societies that feel threatened by a large irredentist neighbor. I mean, Japan had a huge shift in public attitudes that permitted the change to the Constitution, the participation in offensive military operations for the first time since 1945. So it wasn't just Finland that looked at an international order where Russia and China are increasingly assisting each other's efforts to create spheres of influence. Lots of countries, Taiwan is anxious about it, Japan's anxious about it, Finland's anxious about it, Sweden, right? So I do think Russia's invasion of Ukraine did serve as a blaring warning siren that the only way to be safe is to be in a treaty-based alliance with the United States. That's the only guarantee of your safety. And I worry that the behavior of the Trump administration calling those commitments into question might even frighten allies more. It's time for reassurance, not a time for innovation.
Thank you. My question is on whether NATO will survive, yes, but will it thrive? Will many of the compromises it makes now willingly end up becoming compromises it's going to unhappily have to make to keep the US happy? One of the ones I think about is it going to start putting pauses on expansion over the coming years to sort of...
I'm sorry, is it going to start to what?
Put pauses, like hold off on expanding just to keep the US happy?
So it has put pauses on expansion several times to keep the US happy, right? The Biden administration did not want to have a discussion about Ukraine's membership in NATO. That was a US imposed pause. But the US isn't the only country that imposes pauses, right? George W. Bush wanted to admit Georgia and Ukraine in 2008, but he could not get Germany and most of the NATO allies to agree to it. So I think it is wrong to think of any one country as particularly difficult over time. I mean, we are, of course, but because everybody has to win the domestic political argument that they would kill their sons and daughters for the protection of another country. And that's a big ask of anybody. And so getting to the point where everybody feels comfortable making that is the only way to make it durable. And so it happens all the time. I mean, it happened in 1954 when we wanted Germany and others didn't want Germany. It happens pretty routinely. The Eastern Europeans all met the criteria for NATO expansion by about 1993, and we stalled because we wanted to acclimatize the Russians to the changes that were going on. So it's pretty routine for stalling to happen. And the other way to say that is you actually have to get to consensus.
Kind of thinking about your question about Britain versus Iceland, it kind of seems that, like, we're kind of seeing that possible same pattern with the U.S. and Greenland. And I'm curious of, given Greenland's strategic location and increasing interest from both China, Russia, and I suppose the U.S., how should NATO think about Greenland's role in collective defense and deterrence?
Here's actually, it's kind of related from Zoom. This is the question from Zoom. Speaker seems to think that Trump supports Russia over Ukraine. And why do you think so?
Okay, so the answer to your question about what role should Greenland play in America, I think Greenland should play no role. Denmark should, who is the sovereign leader of Greenland, is where to focus your attention. I am really disappointed to report to you that today the United States moved Greenland from being under the authority of the US commander in Europe, to the US commander over American territory. That's an aggressive move by the Trump administration against a longtime NATO ally. I I mean, Denmark's a founding member of the NATO alliance. They not only agreed after September 11th's attacks on the United States to protect us, they fought alongside us in Afghanistan for 21 years. And they had higher per capita casualties than the United States did in that war. It is such a disgraceful thing to do. Moreover, it's completely unnecessary. The kinds of operational military things that the United States is interested in doing on the territory of Greenland, Denmark and the people of Greenland have always let us do. So it's a belligerency that I think is both unnecessary and actually shameful. And do I think the Trump administration has taken Russia's side in the war, and why? So they clearly want to, but it's a beautiful thing about our sweet provincial country that even in foreign policy, the chief executive and commander-in-chief is not unconstrained. When President Trump cut off intelligence sharing and weapons to Ukraine, first of all, it appears it was a colossal screw-up. The Secretary of Defense thought he knew what the president wanted. The president claimed he had no idea what the secretary was doing and overturned it. So it's the clown car aspect of the administration. But the president really does seem to have an affinity for a 19th century spheres of influence kind of great power concert where Russia gets Europe, China gets Asia, and the US gets the Western Hemisphere. And guess what? Trading the world to get the Western Hemisphere, which we already have, is a bad bargain. Like, I despair at times that the president's not a better strategist and that the people around him aren't a cabinet of rivals. They're not even a cabinet of loyal staffers like President Biden had. They are a cabinet of amplifiers of what they think the president wants. They want to run to where they think he's going and get there ahead of him. And that produces scattershot policy that's very often not well thought through, as the tariffs demonstrate, and that's very often poorly executed. How's that for a closing?
On that cheery note.